Good morning. My name is Mark Silver. I'm doing a series of YouTube programs for lawyers. I am a forensics and mitigation expert. I live in New York. I've been at this since 2002. I've done literally thousands of cases. I'm a lawyer. I don't practice, but I am a psychiatric social worker with a background in psychology and political science. And my main focus for criminal, immigration, and civil litigation lawyers is to help humanize the client, to help understand who they are through a deep dive into their psychosocial history, challenges, issues, traumas, and how we better understand who they are as human beings and ultimately understand their judgment, their decision making, and so on. I'm really a crossover expert in the sense that my true expertise is criminal mitigation for immigration defense lawyers. And for criminal lawyers who don't quite know about this, it's for immigration clients who actually have criminal problems in a sense. They have either come into the United States through fraud or misrepresentation that needs to be mitigated through criminal mitigation, or perhaps they're clients who have been living in the United States for many years, perhaps even with a green card, and they have committed various crimes, felonies or misdemeanors, and those need to be mitigated, along with showing the hardships and connections to their family and community. So that's my expertise for immigration defense lawyers, because I have my feet in the criminal mitigation world, where I've done many dozens and dozens of cases for criminal defense lawyers, mostly federal. But there's a flip side to this whole thing that people ask me about, and I've never really done a program on it, so I'm doing it on today, and that is taking what we know from our immigration population from forensics and applying it to the world of criminal defense lawyers for mitigation purposes. In other words, criminal mitigation is really an endeavor to uncover biopsychosocial information of the client's social and psychological history, obviously informed by the facts of the case, with appropriate recommendations to minimize the negative legal outcome with a prosecutor, with a court, or whoever. Our hope is that mitigating circumstances reduces the degree of moral culpability or blame, which in fairness, sympathy, or mercy may lead to a more favorable outcome for the defendant. When we think about this for our criminal defense clients, we think about them having grown up in the United States in good communities, bad communities, having grown up in the United States with great parents, terrible parents, and so on and so forth. But the stark reality is that many of our clients in the criminal defense world have not come from the United States, and certainly their parents have not come to the United States. We are a country of immigrants, and it's most prominent for criminal defense lawyers that practice in major cities such as New York, obviously, but also Miami, Los Angeles, and other cities in the Midwest even, where there are very large immigration populations. What's important is to cull from the forensics in the world of immigration and provide for the immigration defense lawyer through criminal mitigation an understanding of the client's history to better inform the court about these issues. We want to humanize the client's case through a sympathetic narrative, and we can only do that if the client who's an immigrant is asked about his immigrant experience and his life before relocating to the United States. It helps us to induce empathy into the reader and to document the client's life history, especially if the client, has come from a very challenging or even deprived environment in their country of origin. I'm also referring to not just new immigrants to the United States, but the first generation after the new immigrant, because they have invested a lot of time and energy in helping their family members, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But it really is essential to humanize and particularize the immigrant's experience, because it's very different from the average person, obviously, who's always lived in the United States. Many of these clients cannot adequately express their own needs and their immigrant experience. And it's not just about documenting their mental health issues, but really providing a much more holistic understanding of who these clients are, particularly because there's a lot of bias, false assumptions, and stigmatization sometimes for new immigrants to the United States. Some of them are even demonized. There is a sense that if the criminal defendant's an immigrant, the prosecutor feels, look, you've come to the United States, you came from, perhaps a terrible place or a place that you clearly didn't want to live, and you've had every opportunity here to live in this new country, and you've committed a crime. Why should we really give you any consideration? And so it's important to explain the person's psychosocial history to understand how in the world they got into so much trouble. So what I'm first going to talk about is the broad category of explaining the client's negative experiences in his country of origin. And I do a lot of cases for immigration defense lawyers whose clients have come from Central and South America. And just as a very typical example, a client who's come from a small town in Mexico where there's all sorts of privations, what kind of experiences would he have had that would have directed him so strongly to leave his home, his family, perhaps everything he's ever known and loved, to come to the United States? So the first mitigating issue for criminal defense lawyers in the mitigation sphere of understanding is simply poverty. Many of these individuals have come from impoverished circumstances. Now, I don't mean poor like we think about poor in the United States, but rather individuals who've grown up in the absence of basic necessities. They haven't had clean water, proper housing. Often the housing does not protect against insects or inclement weather. Their food may have been inadequate or unhealthy. They may not have had water. Many of these clients have grown up prior to the 70s, certainly, in homes without indoor American-style bathrooms, without flush systems. So when I say poverty, I don't mean that they are poor before coming to the United States. Well, many clients are poor by standard definitions, but that they have lived and grown with the absence of basic necessities. And that's not only for themselves, but for other extended family members and others in the community. The second major mitigation issue is the absence of education. I see a lot of clients who have perhaps a grade 6 education, and it's not the same grade 6 education you get in the United States. Someone who has a grade 6 education is obviously not someone who's had a high school education, but they're well on their way in terms of math and reading and science and so on. The clients I see, it's not just they only have perhaps a grade 6 education, but all of their family members have only grade 6 education, and often their parents had even less education. So the education may be very inadequate. These may be schools that they attended in their country of origin, where there's 30 or 40 children, one teacher for perhaps 3 grades. They don't have resources, computers, and so on. So an absence of education or proper education. Next, alcoholism and drugs. We think about the drug problem coming in from Central South America to the United States, but the drug problem and alcohol problem in these countries is quite horrible sometimes. I have to say, my experience has been most serious in places such as Mexico, especially small towns, where alcoholism is often ubiquitous. The other place that I have found alcohol ubiquitous is in the West Indies, Trinidad, Jamaica, and so on. I have found it a huge problem. There are different kinds of alcohols. In the West Indies, there's a propensity towards rum. In Mexico, it's more towards beer or tequilas and so on. But the point is that many of these clients who've come to the United States have escaped homes in which their parents or uncles or grandfathers were alcoholics. Not only were they alcoholics, but there was no AA programs, there was no support systems. And although that's important, there's been a huge increase in drugs in these countries. Drugs are kind of thought about as a more expensive item. Alcohol is very cheap, of course. But the growth of drugs of different kinds in these countries has also been very serious. So you may have had a client who's come to the United States and grown up in a alcohol or drug-filled home or environment without appropriate supports. Next, because of these issues, you have a lot of people who themselves may have had psychiatric issues that weren't attended to, but you have a lot of people who've had parents and siblings who have psychiatric issues, and there's no clinics. There are no psychiatrists at all or professional mental health caregivers. For many of these individuals, and I've talked about this in my other programs, psychiatric care is anathema to their cultural background, and mental health diagnoses are stigmatized. So you see these criminal clients who, when you talk about their sadness or anxiety they've suffered in their lifetime, and also in their country of origin, they look quite blankly at you because this is not a vocabulary. These aren't areas that anybody ever spoke about at home, and there may have been attachments of shame or humiliation speaking about depression, anxiety, and it was just never spoken about. Another huge area is crime. I see a lot of clients from Mexico, just going back to Mexico, where there's communities with huge rates of crime. There is petty theft, but there's also organized crime. When I say crime, I don't just mean street crime. It's not unusual to hear families whose homes have been broken into repeatedly. I hear this quite often, frankly, from clients from Guyana. And it's also based on gang activity. This gang activity is really bad because the gang activity supports itself by recruiting young members. And who's young? Your client was probably young in his country of origin, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. Many of these gangs, do well in some sense. They have better food, they dress better. And if you're poor, you may look at these gang members, some who are your age or just a few years older, and you may even idealize them. But these gangs are extremely dangerous in other ways as well because they are extortionist. That is, they go to local businesses and even sometimes homeowners, and they say, basically, give me, 10% or 20% of your income from your little store, or you won't have our protection, which is a veiled threat of violence. Abuses in general, because of all these environmental issues, are quite common. People feel hopeless and helpless. They're anxious all the time. They don't have resources and so on. And they turn towards physical, emotional, verbal, and other kinds of abuses. This is common for women, but it's not uncommon actually between spouses. And I cannot tell you how many clients I've seen whose criminal case you think would focus on the criminal issue itself, and they talk endlessly about their mom and dad in their country of origin, where they saw and were terrified by the abuse that their mother experienced as a victim, and how perhaps the client felt a profound sense of guilt that he could not do more to protect his mom. So abuses may be ubiquitous. It may be quite intergenerational. The next major area is social and political unrest. That because these societies don't have very stable governments, or the governments are very corrupt, there's constant social and political unrest, meaning there's no sense of political stability. You may like or dislike our system, and you may trust or distrust it, but there's a predictability about how the system works that's very reassuring to most people. There's a predictability about when elections occur. There's a predictability about the administrative state, and so on. Another huge area is inept police and the unavailability of social services. So just going back to abuse, I'll see a client who said, for example, that he repeatedly see his drunk father beating his mother, and the police don't become involved because they defer to fathers and men in general in the home. These things are considered private, but the police are generally inept. They don't do much. They may even take bribes to get people to have people removed from jail. They're not trained. We always talk in the United States about how much our police officers require more training and sensitivity, and in many departments they get it, and it's great. But in a small town or even medium-sized town in, let's say, Mexico, it's expensive. You don't have the resources to train your cops. and so they may be inept when dealing with social service issues. And in general, social services may just not be available. We're very spoiled in places that have large cities, including New York, where there's many different kinds of social services and programs available to someone who suffered as abuse or as a victim of domestic violence. I spoke about poverty before, but one of the problems is that you have a lot of people in low-paying jobs. In other words, these are people that are employed consistently year after year sometimes, but the job is low-paying and it doesn't yield much. So they're very depressed about it. They feel they can't provide adequate support for family monetarily. Their finances are always low, so they don't really have any savings. They don't have much to spend on. And cost of living is very high in some of these places. Most of my clients don't own cars in these countries of origin. It's not just that the purchase of the automobile is expensive, but the price of fuel is very expensive. We always complain in the United States that our fuel prices are too high. It's always in the paper when it goes up a little bit. It's a major political issue. But there are countries outside of the U.S. where it's surprisingly higher, to the point that there's no real point in purchasing an automobile because you can't afford the upkeep or the fuel for it. So all of these things taken together in the client's country of origin point to few opportunities, meaning that you have a situation where you're stuck in a relatively small town with few resources. There are no support systems. There's all sorts of challenges and traumas internally within the family and so on. And where do you turn to? Sometimes clients in these kinds of situations, their country of origin, move to larger towns or even large cities or even capitals. But what happens in these situations is that, especially with women, they'll go to a large city and then they're taken advantage of in terms of employment, sexually, emotionally, and so on. And it's not necessarily any better, and sometimes it's worse because they're isolated and they feel quite emotionally saddened. They feel perhaps that their failures having gone to this larger town, wanting to do better. So these are all experiences that these immigrants have, and it's no wonder, therefore, that when they come to the United States, they really come with a lot of baggage and challenges. Just in general for women, many of these clients have come from families and communities where there's systemic misogyny, where women are really second-class citizens with regard to employment, education, the community in general, and within their own families. Many of these women have suffered either abuse of various kinds, or if they've seen or become aware of their mother or sister or aunts being abused. In fact, it is so common that it is one of the chief things I ask about when I do hardship evaluations in immigration cases for families. Another issue is that a lot of clients have seen themselves and their family members exhausted by labor. And by that I mean, although this is changing in the last 20 years quite a bit in different areas, and especially in the rural areas in India and China and so on, but for generations, people have engaged in back-breaking agrarian labor on farms where the food may be very inadequate, crops may yield very little, although other years a lot. There may be challenges with droughts and insects. It's back-breaking work, and many people ultimately leave it behind because there's not much that yields from it. And by the way, it's not that different in the United States. If you look at the number of farmers who suffer from these issues, including depression, anxiety, and so on, financial challenges because of farm work, is really quite amazing. Another huge area is that because of all these problems, you have a lot of clients that have grown up in their country of origin without parental supervision. These clients have had parents who are doing their very best under very difficult circumstances. And, the dad is working on the farm, 10, 12, 14, 18 hours a day, and he's absolutely exhausted. And the mom may be doing double duty. She's probably working on the farm to some extent, but she's probably, cooking and cleaning nonstop to take care of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 children. And what you have is children who are not really being raised by their parents. Sometimes, if they're fortunate because they're younger, they're given a modicum of care and support by older siblings who act as surrogate parental caretakers, but sometimes they don't. And sometimes these younger kids have older siblings that are actually terrible parental caretakers. So that's another major issue. Another issue we look at for criminal defendants when looking at immigration mitigation issues is harms that they've suffered for specific reasons. We have clients who are minorities, clients who've suffered persecution or human rights violations because of political positions or affiliations, because of gender, their religion, language spoken, ethnicity, and so on. I just did a case a few days ago. I haven't done one in a while, but it was a Coptic Christian family. He had grown up in Cairo, Egypt. She had grown up in the north in Alexandria, Egypt. And they and their parents and their community in various ways had suffered a wide range of human rights violations by the Muslim majority, including bullying in school, so they had to go to private schools. They were challenged when they went to church. Some of these churches have been attacked and even bombed. Many different kinds of human rights violations that add up clearly to persecution. And while we think of that kind of case as kind of obvious, and it would lead to an asylum case for many individuals, many others suffer human rights violations and persecution as minorities in other ways within their country of origin, including clients that have grown up in their country of origin with sexual identity issues. Perhaps they've been gay and they've been targeted for it, and so on. Some clients also have geographic issues. We don't usually think of this because everything is so connected with the internet now, but we have clients that have grown up in very isolated areas. I had a client from Belize, and she had grandparents that were in an area that was totally isolated with nothing. They led a very healthy life. Her grandparents lived well into their 90s, actually, a healthy outdoor life. There's no junk food and so on. But the isolation can be difficult geographically because you don't have any supports, and you have to do everything for yourself, including mending clothes and, repairing your home and so on. And this can add all sorts of levels of stress. And many of these clients do feel, overwhelming despair and psychological helplessness and hopelessness that can lead to various kinds of depression and anxiety. As a result of coming from somewhere very isolated, clients may be very naive. I've heard this over and over again. I do a lot of cases in India from both Gujarati and Punjab, and I see clients that came from farming communities, and just very, very nice people, and clearly they came from very wonderful families, and they've gone into trouble here. But one of the things they say was, I was so naive. I came from a very sheltered background. I never dated. I had a very rudimentary education. We didn't have a lot of access to social networking or media and so on. We worked very hard. And some of these clients, as a result, are kind of naive about the world. They may be overly trusting. They make decisions that they think are smart, but they're really kind of foolish by general standards. And it really needs to be understood that some of these clients are just sort of finding their way into the world when they come here as young adults. And they're trying to do their very best, having come from a very parochial home or environment. Overall, then, it's also important to understand there could be very serious intergenerational trauma and biological and psychological consequences from all this, including epigenetic, which means that environmental factors can actually change the genes, the proteins on the genes. And a huge area that I want to talk about here is I see a lot of Jewish Hasidic clients almost all of whom come from Eastern Europe, such as Hungary, Poland, Russia, and so on. And, these are individuals who are first generation who've suffered, a wide range of very, very serious traumas before coming here. Obviously, the destruction of 6 million Jews through the Holocaust and the Second World War, but generation after generation of systemic anti-Semitism and racism that these Jews have suffered as individuals, as families, as a community, and so on. So it's not just that we think about the individual before coming to the United States and his experience, but for mitigation purposes, we also think about intergenerational trauma and harm that the person and the community in general may have experienced. So that's one block that we look at for mitigation, which is country of origin issues. The next area is en route. This is rarely considered, but it's potentially quite important, meaning from the time the client decides to leave his home in his country of origin till actually safely getting to the United States, what is his or her experience? And I really say his or her here very, very purposely, because unfortunately the experiences of women in relocating to the United States is obviously much more frightening because of the specter of sexual assault and even rape. Many clients before coming to the United States have years of uncertainty. Are they able to do it? Can they afford it? Can they trust someone such as a coyote to bring them over the border? Will they be leaving their family? Who's going to be harmed? Many clients leave, believe it or not for themselves, but because they want to come to the United States to provide financial resources to their parents. And they're worried about their parents' health over these years. They may be 16 years old, they don't leave till they're 20 for various reasons. And during those years, the parents need medications and physician help and specialty care. And they come to the United States so they can send money back. And the reality is there is a fantastic amount of money that's sent outside the United States every year, including southward, to family members to help them in their basic needs. Clients have told me that they suffer and they witness very harsh conditions on the way here, including terrible cold and heat. They may have to exist without food or water for sometimes days. Clients have noted that they've been raped, although it's relatively unusual that I hear it. But there is violence, there is threats. Sometimes people doing the transportation of individuals suddenly ask for more money. I've had cases where people were being transported to the United States and the person that was transporting them just took off. I'm not sure what would have happened, but the client was then left for their own to navigate through a desert or a mountain area without any map, without any sense whatsoever about which way to go, and sometimes caring for younger siblings, or sometimes they were with an older sibling or an uncle that really doesn't know any better either. There could be a very high cost of coming to the United States illegally, and that cost may continue after being here, paying back coyotes and so on. The other major issue is that coming to the United States is the first step towards major separation. You have clients who may have come from a very loving family in their country of origin, and they're leaving behind their parents and perhaps siblings, and they really endure terrible separation hardship, especially when they're young, while coming to the United States and in the first months and maybe years after being here. I actually see quite a few clients who've been in the United States for sometimes 20 years, and they just well up with tears about the guilt and the emotional trauma of being separated from their mom and their dad for so long. And it's not unusual for many of these immigrant clients to have parents that have died, right? I mean, if you come here when you're 18 and you're still trying for a green card or whatnot, and you have been unable to return to your home in Mexico, or perhaps you cannot return because it's too expensive or it's too violent, whatever, it's not unusual to have parents that become ill or pass away. And often coming to the United States causes the inevitable and sometimes permanent separation of family members and loss, and it leads to illness and death, and that's another major issue. So the first section is issues when the criminal defendant who are mitigating for lived in his country of origin. The second major area concerned en route concerns. And the third, right now, that we're going to look at is new immigrant issues. Immigration is not a phenomenon that happens to everybody, unless you're coming here legally, of course. Almost all illegal immigrants are quite young. They're young for many reasons. I don't want to go into it, but it's relatively more easy to obtain legal status here if you're young. Obviously, people also come here when they're older, especially for employment and education purposes in their 20s and 30s. And those clients can also have had issues in their country of origin, and it's something I really need to emphasize. If you see, an engineer who's highly educated and he's in a very responsible position with duties and responsibilities, and he earns a six-figure salary in his company, and he gets himself into trouble, goes to his criminal defense lawyer. Don't assume that immigrant, because they have a six-figure salary and they're educated as an engineer, that they've had a very positive experience before coming to the United States. That person may have suffered all sorts of challenges and traumas. We have no idea. You need to really delve into the person's psychosocial background. Many of the clients that come here, though, they're unfamiliar with the language, they're unfamiliar with the culture, they're unfamiliar with the geography. Clients come here with little or no support system whatsoever. They may have very poor living conditions. Most of my deportation cases for families have several children, 2, 3, 4 children, and they're struggling like crazy. And I always ask, how can you afford rent in New York? And the obvious answer is they afford rent by living in very small spaces. They'll take a 2-bedroom apartment and put up, a curtain in the living room and create a new space, and they'll put 2 or 3 children in one room, and that's how they live. That's not new. It's been going on for generations. As a result, the living conditions can be very impactful. I know people that don't rent apartments at all when they come here. They just rent rooms long term. I know other people, if they're alone, and I've seen this a lot in the Chinese community, where they rent rooms and they actually rotate the use of the room. In other words, I'll have a client, he works, 9 to 6 or whatever, and he may know someone who works in the evening, and they basically share the space, and they use the bed at different times when the other one is not in the apartment. So the lack of support system, the sense of isolation, the lack of language, and so on, unfamiliarity with support systems and social services, and separation long-term from family members can be very, very difficult. Many clients that come to the United States may also have to choose between education and working for survival. We often wonder why so many of these immigrants don't have better education, but they just don't have the opportunity. They have to work for themselves or for others. There may be cultural or language problems and so on. Some of the clients you see are the first to obtain a college education. I work in Manhattan. Down the street, we have a college called BMCC, and there's a very high number of college students there. It's a 2-year community college program, who are first-generation immigrants whose parents never attended college, and for many of them, their parents never even entered high school. One of the consequences of this is that you have people who come to the United States, sometimes at young ages, and their parents can't help them with school. The parents are unfamiliar with the school system because they didn't go to high school. They can't help with homework. They certainly can't help with reading or math or science, and many of these kids are on their own. Some of these kids need educational assessments, but they don't get them because the parents don't advocate for the kids, because the parents themselves don't understand what the kids need. it's a huge problem, it's a huge burden, and sometimes you get role reversals. So I just had a case last week, and it's quite common, where the client was saying that she took care of her parents. She came at age 4.5. She came from, I'm blanking now, she came from Egypt, and she quickly learned English in school. Her parents struggled and struggled with English. So she took care of the mail when she was 6 and 7 and 8 years old, and so on. She took care of bills. Her parents usually did not go to parent-teacher conferences because they couldn't understand anything. And, my client was, I guess, a little embarrassed by her parents being so awkward. So there are a lot of first-generation immigrant burdens that really influence a person and sort of put them on a particular trajectory. Obviously, many immigrants experience racism, stigma because of how they dress and their accents and so on. And they actually kind of might think they're cool in a way, and they're not. And this is kind of a not so funny issue that I just want to talk about for a minute. You have clients that in their country of origin, they felt very familiar with the culture and environment, and they knew what to do. They knew how to navigate the culture and environment and so on in a very positive way. And they come to the United States and they're just a fish out of water. They don't realize kind of how awkward they are. And, God bless them, let them live and be well, and they'll be great community members. They'll develop here, and they'll have families, and those children will develop, and they'll be great citizens. But for the first generation, they may not themselves realize how they're presenting in an awkward manner. And some of it, of course, may be quite, reflective of their own ego functioning and so on. And, in some of the cases, they may be quite aware of how different than they are coming from a very different place. And so that may inhibit them from pursuing an education or employment tract in one way or another. Clearly, it's a little bit easier in places like New York. This is a very multicultural city. There are not dozens, there are hundreds of languages that are utilized throughout the 5 boroughs of New York. And in a sense, the incredible diversity helps people to fit in, but sometimes not so easily. Some of the new immigrants did not receive proper medical care in their country of origin. Food and water may have been polluted. There could have been all sorts of bacteria, viruses. In fact, many of the clients we see, when they have children who return to their country of origin for a brief visit, they become sick with flu-like or gastrointestinal symptoms and problems. The other obvious issue is that many immigrants that come here are just taken advantage of because of their poor language skills and so on. They're given jobs in which they're not paid fully. Sometimes they're not paid at all. They're lied to about all sorts of employment issues and so on. So these are an array of issues that a client may suffer as either new immigrants as first generation, meaning the children of immigrants. Just to let you know, the phrase first generation, I've seen used both ways. I've seen it used as individuals who've actually themselves immigrated to the United States, but also I've seen it used as people who are here and they're the children of individuals who've relocated to the United States. Many of the clients here not only cannot access the social support systems, and there are many, but they themselves do not have a social support system. The large majority of people that I see, because they've immigrated as teenagers or as young adults, they immigrate alone. They don't have a lot of support system. If they do have family here, they're not necessarily close with them. They may have been separated from the family for many years. And as first-generation immigrants, many of these clients, work 2 or sometimes 3 jobs to make ends meet. Some of these clients, therefore, get involved or become directed in an unhealthy way because they're too, as I said before, they're too trusting, they're too naive about the system. I have clients, on the one hand, when they talk about their problems, they're too ashamed. They're very self-conscious because they've never talked about these problems, and people don't talk about their problems in their country of origin. They also see problems, where in the criminal justice system, where clients are just incredibly trusting. They think, oh, this is the land of golden opportunity, and they just feel they can open up to a police officer, they can open up to anybody about what they've done, and it becomes incriminating evidence. And what they need, obviously, is good criminal defense lawyer to provide them an understanding about what should and what should not be shared, and to get proper counsel and direction that way. When you come from a place where you have had these traumas and challenges, and these challenges and traumas may also have existed en route, and as a first-generation immigrant, you suffer all sorts of challenges and traumas as well, it's not, therefore, illogical that you suffer mental health problems as a result. First, I want to say that a lot of the clients we see in the criminal defendant world who've come from immigrant places where there have been challenges may have all sorts of issues that were never addressed when they were children. I always ask, what was your development like prenatally? And clients don't know. Now, they don't know, obviously, because sometimes their family's not in the United States and they have no contact with their family of origin or reliable information. But sometimes they've grown up in a place where the medical care is just awful, where there are no hospitals. There may be clinics or no physicians in those clinics. So we don't even know about their developmental milestones and whether they suffer developmental disabilities such as learning problems or delays in speech, language, writing, and so on. And when these issues early on are addressed, the person can have a very positive life. And when they're not addressed early on, the person can have a very negative life. This may include, by the way, your client who grew up in, wherever, and they had a severe reading or learning disability that was not addressed, and they became very, self-conscious of it. They were aware of their limitations and how maybe they saw other children or peers in their class view them in a very negative way, and they may have been horribly bullied by it. It may have negatively affected their self-esteem and so on. As I said, many of these clients may have had modest educations. We need to really address them in a very culturally sensitive way. Testing, by the way, may be difficult because it may not be culturally sensitive. We have a lot of clients, therefore, who have come to a point where either early on or now they have symptoms or outright depression, anxiety. Many clients, as a result of the earlier issues I noted, have suffered clinical trauma, PTSD. Some suffer from lifelong generalized anxiety. Some suffer from all other kinds of issues, including guilt that they left behind family or did not do enough for family members to assist them in their time of need. So there are many issues that may relate to their psychological health, their emotional well-being. And some of these clients have not only suffered PTSD and depression, anxiety, but they may have suffered what's called complex trauma, which means that they haven't suffered a single issue of harm, although that needs to be explored, and I talk about complex trauma in a completely different program. But complex trauma suggests that they've suffered repeated harms, physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, other kinds of abuses or harms in their childhood, adolescence, or even young adulthood that suggests not just PTSD, but a more complex kind of trauma that fundamentally affects their judgment, their decision-making, how they relate to people, how they process information, and so on. In mitigation cases for these clients, it may be difficult or impossible to interview family members. Family members may not want to be interviewed. They may not see the value of it. They may think that they themselves are being judged or psychoanalyzed in some way. School records from the country of origin may not be available. There may be no records available for this particular client, and even if records are available, if this client had some kind of learning disability or developmental problem, I'm sure it would not be addressed, and therefore, what is the value of those records at all? Often in these cases, the client, the family members, friends have never spoken to anybody with clinical expertise. And it's very important, therefore, to work with these individuals and explain up front what you're trying to do, how you're trying to help, what your role is, how the interview can be helpful, and so on. I have to tell you, a lot of clients, this is not PC to say, but a lot of clients come to the United States and their children or their children's children, or even themselves, they have a lot of things that are free. The clients, obviously school's free, there's free food, there's activities are free, libraries are free. We have 1 million libraries in New York. You can take out all the books you want for free. Healthcare is free, medication is free, specialists are free, and I can go on and on. And I'm not here to debate whether that's good or bad. But because of this, many immigrant clients that have had the opportunity to enjoy these free things as a start to their new life in the U.S. think that all social services are free, so that their lawyer may recommend a mitigation expert, or I'll see them as an expert doing a forensic evaluation for their immigration case, and they'll be astounded that they have to pay for it. I often get the question, well, doesn't Medicaid pay for you? Isn't Medicaid going to pay for my assessment? And I'll say no. Medicaid pays for medical evaluations and medical assistance and medications and so on. This is a legal matter. The other thing I want to just mention is that you have a lot of clients, particularly those who are undocumented, but if the client is LPR, meaning they have a green card, they're lawful permanent resident, they've committed a crime, the green card either may have been taken away or it's about to be taken away. Many clients and their children for years may suffer from constant anxiety about the unpredictability of the case. Will they be detained by immigration custom enforcement, ICE? Will they be deported? Will their family members be separated? If the dad is detained in a family, who's going to work because the mom may be providing daily care to 3 children at home? Sometimes the other way around, obviously. And in those cases, I have dads that feel, geez, I don't have the parental ability to do what the mom does, or the dad says, my wife and I, we provide roles that very much complement and balance one another to the support of the children. So many of the clients may have long-term fears about one or both of them being deported. And when they get into trouble with this criminal issue that's now being mitigated, it just compounds these problems all the more. I know this was a relatively brief YouTube program. All my YouTube programs are also CLEs, except for this one. This is the first one I've written and provided for criminal defense lawyers, because I've gotten the question so often, are there not issues from the client's country of origin as an immigrant or as a first or second generation immigrant that impact his judgment and decision making? And the answer is yes. The answer is these are clients whose challenges and traumas and issues in their country of origin, and while coming to the United States and living here for the first 5, 10, 15 years, may have all sorts of impacts positively, but also in a very negative sense on their health and well-being, that serve as crucial blocks to build arguments and inroads to a mitigation for pre-sentence or even pre-plea mitigation reports that really are crucial to understanding in a holistic way the psychosocial background of the client. And at the end of the day, this is all about humanizing the client. One of my main books on this subject is on mitigation for criminal immigration defense lawyers, but the subtitle is Humanizing the Client Towards a Better Legal Outcome. You can certainly look at my webpage. All my books are there, and a little bit more about myself. I hope this has been helpful for criminal defense lawyers who have clients that have come from another country. As I said, in major cities such as New York, Miami, Los Angeles, Chicago, and so on, it's quite common. and understanding the client's life before coming to the United States is just as important as understanding the client's life while living in the U.S. Thank you, and I hope this was helpful.